The Chevy 400 small block and the Ford 400, two engines that shared the same displacement but were born from completely different engineering philosophies and corporate agendas. On the surface, they seemed like equals, both boasting 400 cubic inches, but the truth is far more complex and disturbing. What you're about to learn will dismantle everything you've been told about these controversial power plants from the so-called malaise era. These weren't just engines, they were pawns in a hidden war waged inside boardrooms, fueled by fear, ego, and cold profit calculations. Behind the scenes, a quiet but brutal conflict nearly tore both automakers apart. Let's start with Chevrolet's 400 small block, an engine that wasn't supposed to exist. Born in 1970, it was never part of GM's original plan. Internal memos revealed that this engine was a reluctant compromise, created only because big block production couldn't meet demand, and mounting insurance restrictions were forcing buyers towards smaller displacement options. So GM took its 350 small block and pushed it beyond its limits, increasing the board to a massive 4.125 inches while keeping the stroke short at 3.75 inches. The result was an engineering gamble that defied expectations and scared the executives. Despite its success, GM treated the 400 small block like a dirty secret, quietly producing it until 1980 while pretending it didn't belong in the spotlight. On the other side was Ford's 400, commonly referred to as the 400 Modified. Introduced in 1971, it wasn't derived from Ford's popular small block Windsor engines. Instead, it was built on the bones of the larger 351 Cleveland and modified to become a Frankenstein hybrid. While the marketing team insisted it was a mid-sized engine, insiders knew it leaned more toward a big block in both design and weight. Ford gave it a 4.0-inch bore and an equal 4.0-inch stroke, making it more of a torque-focused machine. But unlike Chevy's accidental masterpiece, the 400M was treated with indifference from the beginning, lacking proper development and support. Despite sharing the same 400 cubic inches in displacement, these engines had nothing in common. The differences in bore and stroke weren't just engineering choices, they were strategic moves in a quiet corporate war. But here's where things take a darker turn. Neither company wanted their 400 engine to succeed. GM feared the 400 small block would outshine its big block lineup, which cost more to produce and brought in higher profit margins. Ford, meanwhile, seemed ashamed that its new 400 wasn't truly a small block, and internal departments clashed over what role it should play in the company's future. The performance data tells a shocking story. GM's official ratings for the 400 small block ranged from 150 to 330 horsepower, but leaked dyno sheets painted a different picture. One variant, the L78 400, reportedly made over 380 horsepower with proper tuning. This terrified GM executives, who were already under pressure from regulators and insurers. To downplay the engine's power, GM used highly restrictive testing protocols that intentionally suppressed the numbers. They even used low-performance components in factory models to ensure the engine wouldn't show up their big block offerings. Ford's story is just as messy. Though the 400M was officially rated between 144 and 180 horsepower, internal documents reveal that engineers had developed a high-performance prototype producing over 300 horsepower. This version was secretly tested in Mustangs and F-150s, but was abruptly killed before reaching production. Why? Because it would have outperformed Ford's Windsor small blocks, embarrassing the company's mainstream lineup. Once again, corporate politics silenced innovation. Both engines had untapped potential. With proper support and tuning, they could have easily exceeded 400 horsepower. But internal politics, departmental rivalries, and profit protection strategies kept them locked in mediocrity. Documents from both automakers reveal executives were more afraid of their own engines than they were of each other. The fear wasn't about failure, it was about success that couldn't be monetized. Fear of losing control over their own market strategies. On the racetrack, the consequences of this sabotage became crystal clear. The Chevy 400 small block had all the attributes of a high RPM powerhouse engine. Its large bore and short stroke made it ideal for performance applications, but GM refused to support any major racing programs using the engine. In fact, when private teams began winning with 400-powered cars, GM threatened to cut off their part supply. In one famous case, a Camaro with a 400 small block won 3 NHRA events in a row before GM intervened to have it banned. Publicly, the company cited rule violations. Privately, executives had lobbied race officials to remove their own engine from competition. Ford's treatment of the 400M was even worse. Despite its potential in trucks and marine vehicles, the company never allowed the engine to grow. No high-performance versions were officially offered. Reports showed the 400M could have been Ford the answer to Chevy's small block dominance, but it was quietly suffocated before it had a chance to prove itself. Once again, the decisions were made not in engineering labs, but in boardrooms focused on protecting existing product lines and controlling the narrative. And then came the perfect excuse, the 1973 oil crisis. On the surface, it looked like a natural end for large displacement engines. But inside both companies, it became a convenient cover for something much more calculated. Internal records show both GM and Ford used the crisis to justify phasing out their 400 engines, not because they failed emission standards or lacked efficiency, but because they were simply too good. GM's 400 small block was delivering more power per dollar than any of their big blocks, and customers were noticing. The accountants labeled it a cannibalization crisis. Instead of adapt, GM chose to eliminate the engine entirely. Leaked boardroom transcripts reveal a chilling strategy: lower customer expectations by reducing performance options. The 400 small block didn't die because of regulations, it was intentionally killed because it threatened the profitability of GM's more expensive engines. Ford's motives were no better. In real-world testing, the 400M outperformed several smaller engines in fuel efficiency, but Ford buried those results. Admitting that their Windsor small blocks were inferior would have undermined the company's image and sales. So the data was hidden, and the 400M was quietly pushed aside.
What ultimately killed the Chevy 400 and the Ford 400 wasn't emissions laws, fuel economy concerns, or a lack of innovation. It was fear. Fear of success that couldn't be monetized. Fear of losing control over their own market strategies. These engines were buried, not by regulators or engineers, but by the very companies that built them. And for decades, the truth remained hidden beneath layers of denial, revision, and silence. Testing data from the late 70s revealed something astonishing. Ford's 400 modified engine actually delivered better fuel economy than the widely used 351 Windsor when installed in identical vehicles. But rather than celebrate the efficiency breakthrough, Ford buried the results. Engineers involved in the tests were warned against leaking any details, with some reportedly threatened with termination if they spoke out. What was supposed to be a triumph became a tightly held secret. The most shocking revelations, however, came from behind closed doors. Both General Motors and Ford had developed advanced versions of their respective 400 engines that not only met but exceeded the emission standards projected for the entire next decade. GM's upgraded 400 small block featured early electronic fuel injection and produced a solid 320 horsepower while passing all EPA tests. But the project was abruptly canceled. Why? Because executives feared it would embarrass their upcoming line of computer-controlled engines, which were underperforming by comparison. Ford's story was equally unsettling. Their improved 400 modified was equipped with experimental variable valve timing and multi-port fuel injection. It generated around 280 horsepower on regular pump gas while outperforming all required emissions benchmarks. But in 1979, Ford killed the program, choosing instead to shift marketing efforts towards smaller engines that could be branded more convincingly as fuel efficient. Today, decades later, the collector car market tells the story these corporations tried to erase. Both the Chevy 400 small block and the Ford 400 modified have become cult classics, commanding high prices precisely because they were once suppressed. A factory-spec L78 Chevy 400 small block now sells for anywhere between $8,000 to $15,000 at auction. Meanwhile, Ford's M400, once dismissed and overlooked, has become a rare treasure, with clean examples going for up to $12,000, despite their humble beginnings. But what the collector market doesn't reveal is the depth of the corporate sabotage that followed. In a chilling move, GM implemented a parts destruction initiative in 1981. Over 10,000 brand new 400 small block components were intentionally crushed, and the original tooling was sold off for scrap. Officially, this was framed as inventory control. Internally, it was a calculated move to make restoration difficult, if not impossible. Leaked memos confirmed the goal was to cut off independent builders from gaining access to genuine factory parts. Ford's method was more subtle, but just as effective. Instead of scrapping parts openly, they quietly transferred the 400 Modified's tooling to their truck division. A few years later, during a supposed plant closure in 1983, they claimed the tooling was lost. This made sourcing original Ford components nearly impossible, further complicating efforts to preserve or restore the engine. What's perhaps most ironic is how modern engine platforms quietly carry the DNA of these suppressed power plants. General Motors' current LS engine family, praised for its performance and reliability, borrows heavily from the 400 small block's original bore spacing and deck height, yet GM has never acknowledged this connection. Similarly, Ford's highly regarded Coyote 5.0 V8 features combustion chamber technology first experimented with during the 400 Modified program. Still, you won't find any mention of this heritage in Ford's official documentation. Even today, full specifications for both engines remain partly classified. Detailed metallurgical data, machining tolerances, and exact assembly procedures are still locked away in corporate archives. The reason? If that information were made public, it would prove beyond doubt that both GM and Ford intentionally buried engines that were decades ahead of their time. Power plants that outperformed many of today's supposedly modern designs. This isn't just a story about forgotten engines. It's about the protection of evidence. The collector community isn't just restoring old metal, they're preserving proof of the most calculated act of self-sabotage in automotive history. After years of denials, cover-ups, and engineered obsolescence, the truth is finally rising to the surface. In the end, there's no winner in the war between Chevy 400 small block and Ford 400 Modified. Both engines were casualties of internal fear and corporate insecurity. The 400 small block had all the hallmarks of greatness, an oversized bore, proven architecture, and performance that rivaled big blocks at half the cost. But GM strangled its future to protect pricier engine lines. Ford's M400 could have redefined truck and marine performance with superior torque and adaptability. Instead, it was treated like an embarrassment, neglected, and eventually phased out. And here's the final blow. Neither engine died from environmental regulations or rising fuel prices. They were deliberately eliminated by the companies that built them. Documents now show that with proper investment and continued development, both the Chevy 400 and Ford 400 could have met or exceeded all EPA requirements into the 1990s while still delivering more power than many engines available today. The real conspiracy isn't about what these engines failed to do, it's about what Detroit refused to let them become. Before this truth fades again into history, hit that subscribe button. The companies may still be watching, but now, so are we.